I looked Dr. Dansiger up on the web, on his website, and I came across a sentence that will define him to you pretty well. And I will post how you can find that information out on your own in the chat during the meeting. But this is a sentence that I read that tells me a whole lot about him. Dr. Steve played CBGB and Max's Kansas City in the late 70s. He drank, he played in a toy rock band, and then got sober. In the 80s, he became an international social justice diversity educator and rocker again in the 90s. And now he's sought after as a consultant, trainer, clinician, writer, and meditation teacher. He's written books, he writes poetry, he writes all kinds of stuff. He writes songs. This is a diverse man who has a lot to say. And tonight he's going to talk to us about EMDR. He was here before and spoke with Frank Z. I think you all know him. Actually, you probably know both of them. And they talked about Buddhism and recovery. But you all read about him being an EMDR specialist or therapist and asked him a lot of questions about EMDR. So we've brought him back all by himself, and that's all he's going to talk about all night long. And I am thrilled to hear what he has to say. He's an amazing man, and I think you all will enjoy listening to what he has to tell us about healing addiction with EMDR therapy. So, Steve, take it away. Really glad you're here. Thank you for coming. And I don't think I should have to. I'm not even finding him.
I got it. Thank you.
Okay, good. I didn't hear you, so I was nervous.
I was well muted. I started the talk. I got like halfway through it. Now I only got a couple words in. So thank you for that introduction. Very sweet, and it'd be great if you can come over and tell my wife and daughter all that stuff. I am so glad to be here. I'm so glad you wanted me to come back and talk more about EMDR therapy, because the idea of me talking about it all night long is never far from my mind. It's been my passion and my practice since 2005. I will tell you that when I was introduced to it, I didn't know what was coming. I didn't know that I'd bumped into something that was going to define the way that I would practice my practice of helping others for the rest of my life, as far as I can tell. And I didn't know that it would also integrate everything that I knew up to that point so nicely. That I didn't have to like kind of get real pretzel myself in order to fit into the suit or anything like that. I was just like, oh my gosh, this seems like something very powerful. And so, I was asked earlier, if I was going to use a PowerPoint, and I kind of opting to not, just from the point of view of how many PowerPoints have you been facing down over the last 3 years of your life. But I will say this, here's my offer, is if you'd like a PowerPoint that I think I've done, this talk or talked about this enough that it should match up pretty well. If Patrick is okay with being the recipient of requests for a PowerPoint for this, I'm glad. Yeah, there we go. Thumbs up. So I'm glad to supply y'all, those of you who would benefit from having some notes from what I talked about. So I'll start with, some of you met me before and some of you maybe not. So I won't, well, who knows how far down the rabbit hole I'll go. So I was born in New York. I was born in Brooklyn, more specifically, and raised on Long Island, suburbs of New York. And what that was like for me was, at first, it was, I'll call it an average childhood, as in I don't have any particularly flagrant memories of any kind in my first kind of 8-9 years of my life. And what I mean by that is, mom and dad, and then my sister came 4 years after me. And, I kind of looked around and saw a world that was filled with my friend Eddie Brown and, a couple other friends. And then when I went to school, my first experience of school was, I like this place. We read, we learn, we talk to each other, we develop relationships. I was down with it all. And so the first change in that sort of vision was I was very, very good at school, and I was skipped a grade. Here in the States in the 70s, that was all the rage. If you got straight A's for a couple of minutes, they skipped you a grade. And I was already young for my grade, and I was already small for my age. And so when I went into that next grade, I was just kind of set up for failure / bullying. And that's what happened. And a lot of it was on a number of different subjects, including you're short, which for some reason is some kind of capital offense when you're at that age. And then it was also, I was smart, which is also, as we all know, not popular at that age. And then the other thing was I was Jewish, and I am Jewish, and the surrounding kids were not. And that was just, and at that point, they didn't quite know what that was. They just knew it was the third thing that was different about me. So let's get them. So spent the next couple of years kind of thinking of the world as not a friendly place. And so I won't call it like out and out big T trauma. I would call it the beginning of my sort of chipping away at my psyche and my emotions and my spirit. But they didn't get me right from the beginning. But what got me was when I was 13, my cousin was killed in a drunk driving accident. He was the victim of a drunk driver. And I had just been bar mitzvahed, and I actually had a very positive experience with my bar mitzvah. And the cantor who taught me was a beautiful man, and just everything about it was, I was happy with it. And this death of my cousin, who was like an older brother figure to me, he was 18. I broke up with God. So I just said that, yeah, right, that's a joke. And then that summer is when I discovered alcohol. And I discovered alcohol and cannabis, and I was introduced to it by a camp counselor who was turning on all the kids starting age 12. And that started my story. So, I come to you as a fellow. I come to you as a fellow who then drank and took substances till I was 26, starting at the age 12, 13. And my story there was, as Susie mentioned, when I was 15, my friend said, "Hey, do you like punk rock?" I was like, "Yeah, I've heard of it." And we formed a band, and I got into punk rock drumming, which I have often said saved my life. Like at the same time that it introduced me to folks who were older than me and were willing to share their knowledge about how to maintain an addiction, it also was where I just developed this relationship to creativity and to camaraderie, like in a band sense. And I also did start writing songs. Like there was a lot of creativity. And for me, creativity is a huge part of recovery and trauma recovery and EMDR therapy, quite honestly. And so to speed it up, or just to sort of, put it into this package, I drank, I took substances. I had a career in music that I like to call fame adjacent. But that means I got to record, and I toured, and I did all the things. And when I got sober, it was because I just couldn't do it anymore. When I was 24, I was diagnosed with an enlarged liver. That didn't stop me. When I was 26, maybe some of you have had this experience where I had the 3 beer experience. I was trying to stop, and I was out with some friends, and I'm like, I'll just have a couple of beers. Drank the first beer, and I was like, oh, I feel relaxed. And then I had the second beer, and I was like, whoa, I'm the lampshade guy. And then I had the third beer and I was like, I want to die. Right. So I was like, wow, it only takes me 3 beers to go from like relaxed to I want to die. This is ridiculous. And finally accepted an invitation into an AA meeting, 2nd Avenue Clean and Dry in the Lower East Side of East Village of New York City. And that was 1989. So March of 89. So I've been sober since then, 34 years. And so not everyone who gets sober goes into the helping professions. The way I got there was and by the way, this is all important in terms of talking about EMDR therapy, because it's all contextualized in sort of the experience of individuals and also the sort of clinical understanding of, what might help individuals everywhere. But in any case, I ended up becoming, at first I got signed to Atlantic Records when I had 50 days sober. And so I quit the band because I thought if I got in a van with these people, I would have drank for sure. And then I went into a career counseling program, and I came out a high school English teacher. And then there was racial unrest in the neighborhood I was teaching after a year. And so I got involved in that, in the healing thereof. And I became, for 15 years, a diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice trainer. And also got another record deal. So I did them both. The record deal I got that time was with 3 other sober people. So I toured around and made records sober. It was wonderful. And then in 1998, I'm at the 25th anniversary of this, I had what I called my sober nervous breakdown, which I now know in retrospect was because of untreated trauma, and ended up in a severe depression. I did not drink or use during that time. I'm very grateful because I don't think I would have survived if I had. And I ended up, I had been practicing at a Buddhist temple, and there was a monastery attached to it in upstate New York. And I went to live there and practice there for a year. And what came out of that was already I had a deep belief that mindfulness was a key to many things. And there I found out for myself that it was more than just a technique. I knew that. It was a way of life. And it didn't answer all questions, but it certainly gave a lot of the hints that were necessary. And cut to, I moved to Los Angeles in 2002, where I had a few friends who had moved from New York to LA before me who had become therapists. And they said, hey, you should do that too. And I thought, that sounds too hard. And then I was invited to run a couple of groups at an addiction treatment center, an anger management group and a life skills group. And I thought, oh, this is cool. I like this. So I went back to school, got my master's and my doctorate. And it's after I get my master's that brings me to EMDR therapy. And so up until that point, what I garnered from my clinical education, from my own sobriety, my own recovery, my own therapy, my own mindfulness practice, my own relationships, all of these things, was that it's both and, not either or. And that there's so many, it's not even puzzle pieces. There's so many supports that make it so that I am okay today, as it were. And so when I arrived at the addiction treatment center where I was going to do my training, I was curious what that looked like beyond the piecemeal sort of kind of approach that I kind of had available to me and sort of in mind. So I was responsible for providing mindfulness and also 12-step work. I was working on folks' 12-step work at that rehab and anger management. And there was this one young person who was not getting well. And so the clinical director there had actually started using EMDR therapy as kind of a frontline therapy for addiction. This is 2005. That was not happening at all then. And so I was really curious about what I was seeing. And she asked for some consultation from one of the folks in the EMDR community who had been there since kind of the beginning. His name is Dr. Andrew Leeds. He's still around. And he was giving her consultation, and they invited me to listen. It was phone calls. They invited me to listen in on the phone calls, and I was hearing this language, and it sounded so familiar and so unfamiliar at the same time. And the moral of the story is, though, within the course of about 3 weeks, she started enacting his consultation ideas, and this kid started to get better. When I say kid, he was early 20s. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is kind of magic, because nothing was working with this person. This was like, he's one of those people, this was like his 15th treatment or something like that. And he started to get better. And so I said, I need to get trained in this magic thing. And Dr. Leeds was doing a training that next week or next month. And I got trained, and everything shifted. And the reason it shifted was I got trained, and at the end of the training, I asked Andrew some questions that he hadn't been sort of explicit about. I said, number one, this is a mindfulness-based therapy. How come you're not saying that? And he said, you're right. It is a mindfulness-based therapy. And the reason why we don't talk about it is because when Francine Shapiro developed it in 1987, if you were to go back into the clinical literature in 1987 and look for articles on mindfulness, you will come up with approximately one. Right now, it's like 750 a year or something like that, right? And so Francine Shapiro, those of you who have just this, very little familiarity with EMDR therapy know that there's a little bit of this, right? Like bilateral stimulation. So her thought was, if I tell everyone, hey, everybody, this will make you feel better. Oh, and it's also an ancient Eastern practice called mindfulness, right? It would have been over. And so she kept that mindfulness information close to the vest, and we kind of got it out of her around 2014, 2015. She finally was able to say, okay. So that's one thing. I said, it's mindfulness, because I could feel it in my bones, and I heard it in the language, right? And so then I said, this is a complete psychotherapy. A lot of people, like my experience just sort of when I did my due diligence and such before the training, a lot of people kind of treat this like a kind of a little technique you kind of break out every now and then, right? I said, this is a complete psychotherapy. Like, I can just be an EMDR therapist all day, can I? He goes, yes, absolutely. And again, in 2005, that wasn't the the usual. And I was like, good, because that's what I want to do. And the other thing is, I was very curious, like, how do we think it works? And then he gave me a really good, he had done it during training too, but he gave me a really pretty solid explanation of the possible mechanisms of action that were going on. And they all made sense to me, particularly one, right? And one is that it's mimicking REM sleep, right? In REM sleep, the eyes are going back and forth really fast. I'll talk about this a little bit further in a little bit, but there's also just right-left brain integration. There's also that it's jarring or sort of surprising the working memory in a certain way that gets the working memory to work on this project again and get the elements of the memory moving again so that it can, become fully adaptively resolved the way it was meant to be, but it hadn't been. And then the one that really got me was the orienting response, that it's imitating the orienting response. So thinking about like the animals, right? A deer in the forest. Deer in the forest, let's say it's munching on grass. I'm not sure if that's the actual noise. They're munching on grass, and let's pick a number, 100 times an hour, it hears something, right? And it looks up, like it's got to know that it's safe, right? 100 times an hour, it looks up. 98 times out of 100, it's the wind through the trees. Boring, right? One time out of 100, it might be, ooh, there's the most attractive deer I've ever seen. I'm going to go run towards it, right? The excitement response. And then one time out of 100, it's a bear or the equivalent. And so the deer runs, right? And the deer gets away. And when it gets away, it doesn't end up on the therapist's couch 5 years later talking about the beer incident. It's not on the bar stool that night talking about the bear. It's a deer, right? So what is it doing? It's going through this process, takes about an hour, same for us pretty much, of the cortisol and all the other hormonal and neurochemical changes that go into fight or flight flow out of the body. And you may have seen this or be familiar with this, but like it can end with like violent shaking as it all exits through the extremities as such. And then if I'm a deer, I start munching grass again. And I'm not looking up 110 times an hour. I'm still looking up about 100 times an hour, right? Like we're done with that whole thing that happened. And so the problem with us humans, we have a couple of, like I have some good news and some bad news, right? I have a neocortex, and the neocortex might go, whoa, that really sucked. I'm never going to think about that again, which is impossible. So it's going to be stored somewhere. So it's going to be stored in the short-term memory and in the emotional memory in the body. Or the other way I might go, and I might go at both these at the same time, I might go, whoa, that really sucked. I better be looking for that everywhere all the time. Hypervigilance, right? And so there can also be the freeze response. And some folks talk also about the fawning response. In any case, what happens there is that we are now in this sort of system where those memories are stored in a way that isn't stored here, where I'm like, oh yeah, that happened, but it's not happening now. They're stored in a way where it's just the sensations and the sights and the emotional response and all of those aspects of it, which are available to plug in to a more current thing going on that has the same flavor, and we get triggered. And then that event, this current event, plugs into those older events and reinforces the truth of those, right? Like makes it so that now, my limbic brain and my more, the reptilian brain, my nervous system is running at a speed and with the type of fear base that doesn't allow for processing to the cognitive of anything. Right. And that's where you see people with the worst cases of post-traumatic stress disorder, worst cases of addiction, things like that. And so how does EMDR work? This is where this goes back to, right? When it comes to the orienting response. And again, this was a simple explanation that helped me launch my work. Was what we do is we work together to find out what the memories are that are troubling me. And then it's time to target one of them, right, with reprocessing. We choose it, and what we do is we activate the cognitive, the emotional, limbic, and the body aspects of that memory. We activate. It's like really quick exposure, right? Think of what you might have heard of exposure therapy, where it's like you think of the event over and over and over again. You listen to a recording of the event over and over and over again. With this, we're activating it, and then we're using that bilateral stimulation in order to move to and through it. So the hope is that you're only activated for a minute to a couple of minutes before you're starting to feel some relief, right? So anyway, the very simple explanation then, summary is, the bilateral stimulation is the equivalent of the 98 times out of 100 where it's boring and there's nothing going on. And then we're activating the memory. And at the same time, we're taking that memory that's like this, and we're doing that, and we're joining it to here, to where it's like boring, it's okay. And I can just give you this sort of spoiler alert preview of so many of my clients, when a session has come to, a really positive resolution, it often sounds a little like this, where I ask the client, what are you noticing now? And they say, well, it's kind of like it's a black and white picture. It's about this far away. I can see it clearly that it happened and it was me, but it doesn't have that charge anymore. And I can see that it happened and it's not happening now. And, when you think about, when I think about for myself, the things that I carried around in that way that, if someone asked me, if they activated the cognitive, the emotional, and the body and asked me 0 out of 10, how bad is it right now? Things that were like a 9 or a 10, to have them be a black and white picture that I can look at and go, that happened, it's not happening. Now, I still have my opinion about it. It was awful, but it's not ruling my current experience. So that's a preview of sort of the higher level of how EMDR was presented to me as working, right? Was those combination of those possible mechanisms of action. And just before I go into some more specifics about it, just to say that because Francine Shapiro, who created the therapy, was so research focused, EMDR therapy is one of the most researched therapies that is out there. And that is part of why she kept the mindfulness close to the vest. But, it's in the protocol. Like those of us in the know, we know, that so much of my day as an EMDR therapist is spent in the office saying, what are you noticing now? Okay, notice that. Noticing. Not what are you feeling, not what are you thinking, not what's going on in your body, but what are you noticing, which could be any of those and more, right? So we're trying to teach a client in the early period of EMDR therapy how to be a good noticer. And anyone who can become a good noticer can become a good EMDR therapy client. The reason I put air quotes on that because it sounded kind of strange. But what it is that, with a little bit of decent mindfulness training, anyone can go through a course of EMDR therapy safely and successfully. So, part of what I really want to talk about is, the title of the talk is Healing Addiction with EMDR Therapy. So as I said, I was trained in EMDR therapy while working at an addiction treatment center. And while I was working at that addiction treatment center, the person who first brought EMDR therapy into the world of addiction lived 15 minutes away. And so I got mentored by the first person who saw this as a possible tool in the healing of addiction pretty much weekly for a year. Beautiful person. His name was AJ Popke, passed away about 1.5 years ago. And he basically designed a protocol that pointed EMDR at the urges, the triggers and urges that we experience as people with addiction, right? And so his thought was, if we do that, that will deal with addiction. There was another couple of folks, Jim Knipe is one from here in the States, and then Robert Hayes in Germany. They also came up with addiction protocols. And one last protocol was Robert Miller. By the way, those of you who asked for the PowerPoint, you'll get all this. But Robert Miller, he created this might be familiar to you all as 12-step people, is he created a protocol where he tried to disconnect that feeling of, oh, this works, from that first memory of using, right? Like, the one that you hear at the podium from everyone. It's like, I found the answer. I know that I did. I know that when I first took a drink, I was like, I have found the answer to the question, right? And I then tried to recreate that feeling and knowledge for the next 14 years, right? Like, you just keep on going for that. So he created a protocol for that. So anyway, a lot of these addiction protocols were built as the idea being, this is how we shall treat addiction. The more holistic approach that myself and my colleague Jamie Marich, who I wrote the book Healing Addiction with EMDR Therapy with, and others in our community, is that we need to approach addiction the same way we approach any and all of the other the spectrum or the world of mental health issues, right? So instead of thinking, oh, I'll get the triggers and the urges, or I'll knock this out or knock that out part of addiction. No, we're going to do the same thing we're doing with everything else, which is getting underneath the hood, right, of the possible trauma that is at least part of the driver of an addiction. And so another sort of not a caveat, but more of again, contextualizing this idea of using trauma therapy as a primary therapy for addiction, is that Shapiro, when she first created the therapy in 1987, she talked about two things. She talked about big T trauma and little t trauma. So that idea was born out of looking at big T trauma as anything that theoretically we would all agree on would be trauma, or put in a clinical sense, anything that triggered the first criteria of PTSD diagnosis, something life-threatening that that rises to that level, combat, earthquake, assault, things like that. And little t trauma was everything else, right? And that was the thing. She had a hard time convincing people in the beginning. Now we're all pretty convinced, those of us in the community, the trauma community. We've changed it from small t trauma to adverse life events, right? So it's thinking of it this way. There's a continuum, a spectrum of life, the continuum of life. And in that continuum, there's, old age, sickness, and death, and all the other stuff that's just like the hardest of the hardest, the worst of the worst. And then over here is like traffic on the 405 freeway. You have your own equivalent wherever you live, right? There's like when my daughter, who now is like, my daughter said, fuck you to me for the first time. Pardon my language, but I was just like, a couple of people said, you are now officially an actual parent. But, she's 13 now, right? So my name used to be Daddy. Now my name is Dad. Anyway, when she wakes up in the morning, she doesn't go, oh, I can't wait to go to school. Like, let's go to school. Like she wakes up and she goes, go away. And anyway, I could turn that into World War III. I could turn that into a diagnosis for myself when all is said and done, right? If I get in there and go with that, that could become big T trauma. In that moment, it's little t trauma. It's an adverse life event. And then the key is, how do I respond to that? Now, if I have a whole bunch of unhealed trauma related to waking up a 13-year-old or something with that flavor, there's a chance that could come up, and my response to her will, she'd say F you, and I'd say F you right back, or something like that. And so there's that, the framework of, it's not so much about trauma, not trauma. It's about the continuum of how life is not the easiest thing to do, and that anything could possibly turn into something that makes me turn on myself, or brings on depression or anxiety, or a need for a cocktail, right? And so then the other framework that I use, and that was what Frank and I were talking about last time, is this Buddhist conception of the Four Noble Truths, which sort of, for me, matches Shapiro's conception of this continuum of trauma and adverse life events, where the Buddha said in the first Noble Truth that life has suffering. The word is dukkha in Pali or in Sanskrit. And, it's hard to argue with that, right? Life contains suffering. And it really contains suffering on this level of old age, sickness, and death. And it also includes, like traffic and children who won't go to school on time, right? And everything in between. And so then the second truth says so that's the diagnosis. And then there's the causes and symptoms, right? And the causes and symptoms are not the pain of life. The causes and symptoms are my reaction to the pain of life, right? Or just to life, right? It's my craving, my clinging, my craving for what I want, my aversion to what I don't like, my clinging to that which I have, right? All of those. And so, okay, that's the cause. And then the third truth says that there is a cure, right? And that cure is not going to be found from eliminating the pain of life, impossible. But we can cure, we can eliminate or transform craving, clinging, aversion, right? And then Buddha gave the prescription for that cure, which was the Eightfold Path. And so the Eightfold Path says, if I build and maintain wisdom and then set my intentions in life, micro intentions and macro intentions, if I set those intentions in life from a place of that wisdom, and then I speak in the world, I act in the world, and I work in the world, right? And then how do I get that wisdom real tuned up? Is I make the effort to practice mindfulness and concentration, right? So that's this formula that Buddha talked about. And when it comes to EMDR therapy and how it relates to that, it's really in that second and third truth, especially, right? In that, in a sense, 2,600 years ago, Buddha kind of intuited, without the brain scan equipment, the way that the primitive parts of the brain take care of us and go and help us survive. And that can glitch and get to the place where we're no longer able to get to insight. You know, that's where wisdom is, right? And so looking at it through this sort of dual, but to my mind, what pathway, then what you have is the possibility that we can, clinicians and non-clinicians, can help facilitate the healing of trauma by following the sort of framework and the steps of what it means to bring maladaptively stored memories, as in memories that haven't gone through the whole process of getting to the long-term memory, so that we can address our lives from all parts of our brain and our body and our spirit, right? So, so that's the Buddhist framework. Here's the EMDR framework. I'll tell you how it works. It's a eight-phase protocol, and it operates according to what is called the adaptive information processing model. And so the eight-phase protocol is set up to match a theory proposed by Pierre Genet, a psychiatrist from 1889. He developed this and was forgotten for a long time and then resurrected by folks in the trauma community. And he said you can't just jump a person into treating their trauma, right? You need to prepare them and stabilize them. Then you can work on the traumatic memories. And then you need to have a landing pad for them. Some old school therapies really, and I don't think they were nefarious, they were just working with what they had, right? Were like, tell me everything that happened. And tell me everything that happened, and that's what's going to work. And in fact, oftentimes that just re-traumatizes a person. So EMDR therapy is set up this way. The first phase is called history taking, but it also includes the building of rapport, like anyone would do in a therapeutic relationship. And it involves taking history in a very specific way. So let me map this out for you from the perspective of addiction too, is when I meet a person for the first time, I tell them, you don't have to tell me your whole story for me to help you get better. And often people are surprised by that. And then what we do is something called thematic history taking. I don't need the chronology. The chronology is not important. What I just need to know is what's the problem, right? So what are the presenting issues? And then what are the themes that go with those presenting issues? And then what we do together is we take those presenting issues and those themes, and we discover what negative beliefs about self that person is carrying around now because of those problems. Like, I'm not good enough, or I'm not worthy, or I'm not in control, or any of those kind of things. Then we take those negative beliefs and we do something called a float back, which very simply is, I am not in control. Float back in your memory, right? This is an exercise that we do after we've prepared them for even this exercise, right? Go back in your memory on I am not in control and just tell me the earliest time you can remember having that belief, right? And so what we end up with are these connected beliefs by negative belief that are also kind of connected by theme. And what you also get, that's really one of the more fascinating parts of EMDR therapy for me forever, like still 17, 18 years later, is you almost always a client will say, oh my God, I haven't thought of that in a million years. And often it's like something that isn't, an obvious thing that you would think of or remember. Like an example I give my trainees when I'm training EMDR therapists, I talk about how in my own therapy, when I was a kid, one of the things that I had really good with my dad was he was my coach in sports. He coached me in basketball and in baseball. And he was one of those coaches that was like, with kids, everyone plays, everyone has a good time. That's the most important thing. So he never gave me a hard time about anything. And one day I was pitching the big game. I was the pitcher in the championship game and I lost. And I was devastated. And when I looked at him, I didn't get like, it's okay, kid. I got like, you fucked that up. And I had forgotten that, really. I had never thought about that until this came up in an EMDR session where I was going down the road of I'm not good enough. And I was like, oh my God. Like I had other bigger I'm not good enoughs later, but I was like, that's the source of it. Like I started going there then. Powerful. And so what we've done by the end of that process is we've gathered all the targets that pertain to the work that we're going to do. And an image that I use for my trainees and for clients is who are 12-step savvy. It's kind of like the fourth step. When in the fourth step, you're writing and writing and writing, and it feels like I have an infinite amount of fourth step. This shall never end. I have so much bad and so much resentment. And then one day you're kind of like done, right? And so it's finite. That was one of the gifts of the fourth step to me. It was seeing that my Mishigas was finite. And then I found out in the fifth step too, that my 32-page fourth step, according to my sponsor, Randy, was actually only 3 pages long. He said, you do 3 pages of the same shit to different people over and over and over. I was like, that was my first spiritual experience. I was like, you nailed that. So at the end of that first phase, you have this history. And then the second phase, and by the way, first 2 phases are the least linear of the phases. In other words, they can be flipped. They're very integrated, is resourcing, preparation. And so that's where we're finding out from the client, what is it that helps you feel good? What helps you feel okay, internally and externally? So we're not just looking for like little meditation exercises and things like that. Like if a person's running a 12-step program, it's like, my sponsor, my program, my meetings, my home group, right? We want to know all the resources the person has because they're all pertinent to this recovery. And so then this next part, phases 3 through 6, is what Jamie and I in our book called Shapiro's Special Sauce, because it's what's different from the other therapies. And in phases 3 through 6, what we do is we take one of the memories from that phase 1 list and we run it through the phase 3 worksheet, which, like I said earlier, activates the memory, right? The cognitive. And by the time we're done, 45 seconds later, that person is thinking and feeling and in the thing. And then we go into phase 4 and we say, notice all that and follow my fingers, or hold these pulsars and do that, or tap yourself, or hear these tones, right? And so we do that in silence for about 45 seconds or so. And then I stop whatever it is that we're doing, the eye movements, I'll stop and I'll say, take a breath. And I'll say, what are you noticing now? And they'll tell me what they notice. And 9 times out of 10, I will then say, notice that, and deliver the next set. And what's happening through that is, again, through those positive mechanisms of action, is that the memory's been activated, and now linkages that failed to happen when the original event happened are now linking. And the other thing is that all those other memories along those associated memory networks that are also linked are coming into play. And so oftentimes when I'm working on one memory, I often end up, like, let's say we successfully reprocess a memory. When we go back to that phase 1 list, there's like 3 or 4 other things. Oh yeah, that's not a thing anymore. That's not a thing anymore. That's not. There's a generalization between targets. And so phase 4 is that desensitization, right? It's got Valium without side effects. And then phase 5 is called installation. And that is installation of a positive belief with the new version of the memory. In other words, we're not satisfied with just making it feel a little better. Now we're turning it into a resource. We're making it so that I am worthy is connected to that black and white picture that I hold over here. And then the last one is phase 6, which is we then check the body. We just do a quick body scan, see if there's anything residual left over. And then phase 7 is closure of the session. We never do reprocessing all the way to the end, right? Because someone might still be activated. You don't want to leave them vulnerable like that. The last 10 minutes is spent doing whatever it is that client in front of me needs to get themselves good, to get back outside into the world filled with fluorescent lights and difficult people. And then phase 8 has 2 pieces to it. There's the micro version, which is when the person comes back, let's say they're weekly, they come back the next week. You're still in phase 8. You check your work from last week and then proceed with whatever you're going to proceed with. And then phase 8, in a larger sense, is the way we treatment plan. And so that means that, you know, like with any therapy, we're reassessing where we're at. We're watching the number of targets being crossed out. We're seeing new targets that are coming up during the reprocessing. And that's the other thing about EMDR therapy, is meant to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so the end of therapy with EMDR therapy is everything's crossed out. And then we check to make sure that's true. And then the goal is, my goal is, you know, I'm sure I would find all of you lovely and want to hang out with you more, but I would rather you feel better and then go live your fabulous life. So that's the goal of EMDR therapy. And one thing I can tell you about it that I say to my trainees is, you know, if someone comes in your office and you're like immediately, oh my gosh, this is 5 years of work, you know, it's really, they're in a state. That person is more like a year with EMDR therapy. So it doesn't make it into like 12 sessions, but it makes it much shorter, right? And similar kinds of, you know, cut it down with shorter periods of time. I'll say a little bit more. If it's all right, I'll go another 5 or 10 minutes, and then like leave the floor open, and I can fill in some blanks if there are some blanks. But Shapiro, from the very beginning, she thought of this as a complete psychotherapy, and there was actually a book. It didn't come out till 2002 that really looked at how integrative and integrated this therapy is. In other words, you know, it really draws on the greatest hits, I think, of Western, Eastern, and indigenous psychology and spirituality. And as such, that was the way I approached it. And then in 2015, I was about to leave the field. I was kind of toasty. And I was offered the opportunity to set up and be clinical director of a Buddhist treatment center. And so I thought, I haven't done that, and that's my wheelhouse. So let's try that and see if that keeps me here. And it immediately did. I was like, oh, this is right. And then I had the thought, what if EMDR therapy and mindfulness were the center lane of treatment for addiction, right? Like, every treatment center has its center lane, 12-step, medical model, harm reduction, whatever it is. So what if we did that? What would the result of that be? And then based on that, what if we were looking at addiction through a trauma-focused lens? And what would that mean for the rest of the team? And so came up with a training program for everyone from the CEO to the person cutting the grass at the residential center in trauma-focused care, so that there were no holes in the dam, right? That there were always, that anyone and everyone who was approached by a client knew the status of this client as person in trauma-focused addiction recovery. And then train all the staff in mindfulness for self-care and other care, and train all the staff, the clinicians, in EMDR therapy, and fold everything into the EMDR therapy instead of having EMDR as an ancillary device. So I incubated that for 3 years in 2 centers, and now that's kind of what I'm about now. This is the thing. And when I say it's a thing, it's like it's a passionate belief that we may actually be able to have more people get well in the context of that which is trauma focused in terms of addiction and addiction recovery. I go back to Andrew Leeds, who trained me in EMDR therapy. He wasn't an addiction specialist, and I was curious about his thoughts about addiction. And he said, he's also a man of very few words. He said, addiction, genetics, trauma, or both. And so coming from that place, I feel like it's not too far off to be able to say, especially if you come from that place that I talked about before, about that continuum of suffering in the Buddhist conception, that addiction is this very structured, in a sense, and sometimes it feels out of control, but sometimes it feels very in control way of dealing with trauma, of dealing with adverse life events, right? And so if I'm able to take a person's history when they come to me for addiction care, putting the addiction in the context of everything else, I'm better able to then point this trauma-focused modality at all of the aspects of it, including the triggers and the urges, and provide a comprehensive and sustainable treatment plan for someone. I also, noticed that one of the things that people used to say is you can't treat trauma in early recovery. You're going to make them relapse, was often the thought. But in fact, there's so many folks who, if you don't treat the trauma, that's why they keep relapsing. Like, I've had so much interesting success working this way when I'm faced with someone who's been to multiple treatments. And I asked, we're doing the intake, and they basically have been dragging around this intake form to the last 10 treatment centers. When I was 8, this happened. When I was 12, this happened. And because it's not addressed, they go out and then they come back and they've got the same intake form. So what I've noticed is that, if I approach a client as being in phase 1 of EMDR therapy from the moment I meet them, right, then I can truly assess what is the trauma history, what is the set of resources, right? Like, oftentimes, like I've had people who come in for detox, like physical detox, who are really resourced. And that once they come out of their detox, very early in their recovery, they're ready to do this work. And they even need and request to do this work. So again, a lot of this really comes out of, I hope it's been helpful, the way I mapped it out for you. I feel like, it's, for me, it's all about both and, which makes scientists freaking crazy, because that's not, helpful. But, EMDR therapy, mindfulness, good quality 12-step recovery. Like I'm still going to meetings. It's still part of my thing. I'm writing books on trauma in the 12 steps with Jamie. I feel like this is the next phase for addiction recovery. And it doesn't replace anything. It just gives some of the engine fuel that folks didn't know was there, and also provides care for people who are early in their recovery. If they are in a treatment center is a wonderful place, a contained place to start this kind of work, as opposed to the opposite.